Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. Today we are making a set of squares. But how exactly do you make a square without a square and make sure that it is indeed square? Let's dive in. Let's pull out a scrap of walnut and white oak, two woods that I love working with. And we're going to make a square and a miter square. So this is just a hunk that I have used for many projects. It was a scrap that I got out of a junk bin at a cabinet shop. It's actually the same scrap that I made my jaw vices out of. But this little piece at the end still has a good bit of use left in it. So I'm actually going to cut off some 3/4 inch wide pieces. So I'm going to make 3/4 inch stock out of this 2-inch thick stock. I'm making little boards out of big boards. And just cutting down the line. Now this is one of these skills that is very scary when you first get going. But once you learn how to steer a saw and focus on, rather than bringing it back onto line, going back and correcting the line, it's much easier to do that than it is to try and bring it back onto the line and force it into place, because then you start making this S-curve going past the line and coming back and forth. Back up, fix the line, and then continue down. That's why your saws have some set. Now we're going to get rid of all of the saw marks on that, bring it right down to that marking gauge line we had on it. And for this I'm bringing in the smoothing plane and getting it clean. We're going to joint one edge, and that way I know I have a 90 degrees to the edge that is planed earlier. And this will get me the beam stock, and so this will be the beam of the square. Next, I'm actually going to bring it down to the correct thickness. Now that I've one side planed, we can plane the other side down. I'm going to use a scrub plane, so I need to get rid of about a 1/4 inch at one end, tapering down to almost nothing at the other end. After the scrub plane, then we can come in with the rough plane, and then the jointing plane, making sure I have a nice flat edge all the way along it, and then the smoothing plane for that final pass to clean it all up. Now I'm going to cut these. I'm going to make both beams for both squares out of this one piece. So we're going to cut the first one to length of the actual square, and we're going to cut that off. I'm just using the mirror to figure out what is 90 degrees. That way I'm not going to actually be checking it or taking it to a shooting board. If you have a shooting board, then great. But here I can put one board across. I know it's the exact same thickness, and then I can go from that little mark down to the corner, and I know that is exactly 45 degrees because it's the same dimension either way. I'm sure Pythagoras would have something to say about that. So I'm going to cut on one end 45 degrees, then use that scrap to mark off the other end, and that gives me 45 degrees on both ends. And then I can use this as a square to then mark up the straight edge we'll be putting on in a little bit. So you don't need a square to make a square. You can use little tricks and ways to eyeball it. We'll be talking about how to actually square up the square a little later. So now for the main straight edge, I'm going to be cutting a 1/4 inch thick stock out of this white oak. And I'm picking straight grain stuff. I want stuff that is really nice and clean. The straighter the grain, the better. It just makes it more stable, especially when working with wood that moves over time. So we'll cut this down to a 1/4 inch, and then we are going to plane it smooth. But I need to make two of them because the piece wasn't quite long enough to get both of the straight edges out. So we'll cut one 1/4 inch strip, and then we'll cut another 1/4 inch strip, and we'll just keep on going from there. Now, planing the side smooth on thin stock is somewhat difficult. It's a little bit easier if you have dogs to put it between, which is what I'm going to use. However, if it's a lot thinner, you can actually use a double-sided tape to stick it down to the surface and just have a planing stop at one end. But here I'm actually going to clamp it between a couple dogs. It's going to bow up in the middle, but that's okay because once the plane is down on it, it holds it down. And we're going to plane it right down to those marking gauge lines. So before we had cut this at 45 degrees with the little trick of figuring out where that's at. Now we can use the square to actually lay out where we want to cut this. We'll cut one end and then cut the other end off. And now we need to actually create the mortise for this straight edge to fit into the end of our square. To do that, we're going to make two marks, the exact thickness of the straight edge to go in. Then we can set our mortise gauge on those two marks and draw around the end however deep we want it to go in. I want the straight edge to go into it, but I don't want it to go in and be flush on the top. I want it to be sticking up a little bit. That gives you a little bit to work with. So as the square needs to be adjusted over time, you can remove and add material. Well, I don't know if you really want to add material, but you can remove it. You're going to do the exact same thing for the 45 degrees, except for, surprise, surprise, it's at 45 degrees as opposed to 90 degrees. And in this case, don't let the 45 degree worry you. It's a degree, just like 90 degrees. So for removing that, we're going to chop in, and then chop in, and then chop in, and then chop in until we remove all these little pieces. And this is actually kind of a fun thing because you can go down pretty heavily at this depth, and then you can remove that wedge out, and it's kind of fun. Once that is removed, the majority of it, we can come in with files and rasps and floats and work off the sides and the bottom to get that to fit all the way down in. Particularly, I'm going to focus on either side first. This is actually a crescent file from Nerix that I've really been liking. I got a set of those, and they are very, very pleasing. I'm using them more and more. We can fit it all the way down in, but we need to hit the bottom. And this is an old Planemaker's float. I've sharpened several times, and it's a slightly less than a 1/4 inch, but perfect for things like this. It allows me to flatten out the bottom of the joint, so it seats all the way down nicely. Going to do the same thing with the 45 degrees, but with the 45 degrees, it's actually much easier to chop in because you can just chop in from one side, and the chips chunk out. You don't have to pop them out from the end as easily. And so we can just chop most of the way down. I don't want to blow out the other side. We're going to get as close as we can because it's easier going with the grain. And on this side, you have to go against the grain. So you want to do as little as possible from that side. So the same thing here. We want to work on the two sides. Make sure that the opening is wide enough to receive the straight edge that will fit down into it. And then we can get the bottom and flatten that out. And go for our test fit. Yay! Sometimes it's easier. You get these little chunks where it's easier to get the chisel in. In this case, there was a fairly large hump in the middle, and it was easier to chisel it out than it was to float it out. Prior to the glue up, we want to chamfer all of the edges that will be inside of the glue up so that it's much easier to do them now than it is later. Just going to be using some Titebond 2, my standard go-to glue for the moment in the shop. And then clamp it all up. Now here's the point where you want to clamp it up square. And so ahead of time, I actually drew lines on this edge, on this board. The edge closest to me is perfectly straight, and I have these lines on it that are 90 degrees. And the way I did that is I put the square on there, drew a line, and then flipped it over and drew the same line on the same side, and I can see the deviation, and I can move them back and forth until I get that line perfect. I can do the same thing with the 45, except for I have to do it on a corner rather than on a straight edge. And so using a factory board for that makes it pretty quick. So I can get those lines on there, get these close to where they need to be, and then I can put them on the board and set them up before actually clamping them down in place. So I can set it on there, check it against the line, make adjustments, check it against the line, make adjustments, and make sure everything is just right. So when the glue up, we're 90% of the way there. Now, chances are they're going to move during the glue up. That's okay. That's life. We'll be able to do some adjustments afterwards, but this will at least get us very, very, very close to it. After the glue up, now we can take them out and see what we want to do next. At this point, they're done. They're squares. You really don't need to do anything more. But we want to do more because we can. And I was recently sent a little bag of some ebony keys from a friend who was tearing apart a piano and had these. And it's like, you want them? And I'm like, yes, I do. Some old growth ebony. You don't get to play with that too often. But if you know of anyone who has a piano they're getting rid of, you might get lucky and find some of these in here. I'm going to use a dowel plate. This is one from DFM Toolworks that I absolutely love. And so I can shape this down to the size I want. And so you just start at the one hole that it will fit through, and then progressively pound it down through them until you get it round, until you get down to this one. And at this point it went pop. Oh, I chipped off a little piece. Oh well, I only used half of that one, but I had a couple of them to work with. So we're going to actually bore out the hole all the way through this, and then put the dowel in. Now here I'm drilling almost all the way through until I feel the drill bit poking out the other side. This way I don't blow out on the other side. I get a nice clean one. And I have that hole that comes through on this side that I can then put the brace into and make sure it pops through and nails my finger. And let's put a band-aid on that. So just go through until the bit sticks through just a little bit. Turn it around and drill from the other side, and that way you'll get a really nice clean hole from both sides. Looks fantastic. For gluing these pins in, they're more or less there for aesthetics. They really don't need any function because the long grain to long grain is fine. So in this case, I'm just going to use a super glue. Goes in there. It's 2p10, and then we'll flush cut it and put the next one in. I really need to get a new flush cut saw. I'm missing several teeth on this one, and it's bad. But after the super glue's on there, then we can plane it down, smooth it up, and get ready for the next step. And I love planing these up. And you can see there's one that has a little bit of chip out on it. And, oh well, such is life. I'm going to use a glue stick to glue on a pattern because we're going to do some carving on these. It's not a wood by Wright tool unless it has some carving, right? Yeah. So keep a strap on the bench, and I'm just going to be using a simple V-tool. This is the easiest way to get into carving. If you can follow a line somewhat closely with a pen or pencil, you can do this. So I'm just going to modify this pattern that I found on, I think it was Google Images, and just find one that I like and put it on there and shape it up and go to town. So I just follow the line with the chisel, tapping away on it. You get far more control with the chisel than you do freehand. Though freehand is a little bit faster, the chisel actually gives you the control so you don't go past the line. Then we can scrape it off, and this is the beginning of the finishing. And so we can actually use the card scraper to scrape the surface and get a nice clean surface ready for finish. So a lot of people, for some reason, really don't like it when I glue it on and then scrape it off, but I really like doing it that way. It's fast and it's efficient. The pattern stays right where you want it to be, and you're gonna need to scrape and finish it anyways, so why not just make that the beginning of the scraping and finishing. Here's a little closer look. Did some modifications on one of them to then fit the 45 degrees, and you just follow the line and run around it. It goes pretty quickly. I think these were all of 10 minutes each, so probably about 20 minutes of carving into the set. Scrape it off, and we're ready to start working on the final adjustments. So you can see I draw one line, flip the square over, and then I'm going to draw another line beside it. And this will allow me to make sure that the two on there, I can see that there's a variance. At my side, the lines don't quite match, and then at the other side, they match up. So that means I need to take a little bit off. So I'll start at one end and then take longer and longer and longer strokes until I cover the whole thing, and then one clean pass to flatten it out. And then we can check it again, make sure that works. I'm going to do it on both the inside and outside of the square until those two lines match up perfectly. Now it's time for the last little bits of detail, some of the chamfering that needs to go on, and then we can apply the finish. Can you guess what I'm going to use? Oh yeah, homemade boiled linseed oil. I love this stuff, especially with walnut and white oak. Oh, just the colors that come out. And then that ebony. Oh, I'm happy. Very, very happy. Yeah, boiled linseed oil just has such a tone to it that is gorgeous in almost every wood. Except for like pine and maple, but who likes to work with pine and maple anyways? Sorry, I just hurt a bunch of feelings there. We can let those set aside, let it soak in as much, come back 15 minutes later, add more, let it soak in as much, come back 15 minutes later, let it add more until they are done. Add a little bit of paste wax, and there we go. Nice set of squares, ready for a long life of fun. And there you go. These squares are actually made for my Secret Santa this year. So I am actually going to be shipping these out to him. So congratulations to whoever got those. But if you'd like to join Secret Santa next year, we'll be doing that on the Hivemind. We have a group on Facebook called Wood by Wright Hivemind, and that's where I bounce ideas off of people. And we do some interesting things like this throughout the year. So if you want to find out more about that, I'll try and leave a link to the Hivemind down below. So making squares is always a fun little project. You can whip them out relatively quickly. They don't have to be amazing. They don't have to have carving. They can just be a square shape. And making an unsquare or a miter square is really not that big a difference between them. It's at an angle, and to a hand tool woodworker, an angle is just anything else. I mean, that's also at an angle. It just happens to be 90 degrees rather than 45 degrees. So have a little bit of fun. Try something new and experiment in the shop. I hope you like this one. If you did, let me know that down in the comments down below. Also, let me know if you have any ideas or suggestions, things I did right or things I did wrong. I'd love to hear that. On top of all that, I want to say a huge thank you to all of the patrons on Patreon, members here on the channel, people who buy things from the Wood by Wright store. Thank you for that. Honestly, this channel keeps going because people are willing to support it. You notice I don't have any sponsors or anyone writing. I do this completely for you guys, and so I get to say what I want to say. So if you do ever meet anyone who's scrolling over here on the side, tell them thank you, because they're the ones who quite literally are keeping this channel going. So I think that'll do it for now, and until next time, have a wonderful day. My wife thinks I'm a square, but in all actuality, I know that I am unsquare.